Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the latest installment of ITI's Bridge for Innovation series. Our Bridge for Innovation series highlights how good tech policy builds the foundation for the future. My name is Jason Oxman. I'm the president and CEO of ITI, the leading global advocate for the tech industry. If there's one thing the tech industry knows, it's the importance of the innovation economy to U.S. competitiveness. Our member companies are on the leading edge when it comes to developing revolutionary products and services, and none of it would be possible without research and development. Research and development advances the U.S. economy. It creates opportunities for U.S. workers and allows the U.S. to compete meaningfully with its global competitors. Unfortunately, the United States currently ranks 30th out of 38 OECD countries with respect to research and development incentives. Since 2022, the US has become even less attractive a place for research and development and new innovations, thanks to a new requirement that makes companies repay research and development expenses over 5 years instead of in the year that they occur. Fortunately, a recent bipartisan measure, the American Innovation and Jobs Act, would reverse this harmful trend and allow companies to immediately expense research and development investments. Restoring this ability would alleviate supply chain costs and create resources to increase salaries for U.S. workers, since about 70% of research and development spending is for wages and salaries for employees. Now, today we have a unique opportunity to hear from the co-leads, the legislative sponsors of this bill. And we're going to hear how this legislation will support investment in domestic research and development. Our conversation will also explore other ways government and industry can work together to advance innovation, growth, and U.S. competitiveness through research and development. Now, we encourage you to be part of the conversation as well by using the hashtag Bridge for Innovation on your favorite social media channel. And now let's jump right into today's conversation. It's my honor to introduce Congressman Ron Estes and Congressman John Larson, who are the co-leads on the American Innovation and Jobs Act. Congressman Estes represents Kansas's 4th District. He serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, the Budget Committee, and chairs the newly launched House Aerospace Caucus, which works to promote technological innovation in the U.S. aviation, defense, and space industries. He has been a leader on passing landmark tax reform and helping to implement trade agreements that are beneficial to U.S. companies. Congressman Estes, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Jason. It's great to be here.
And I also want to introduce your colleague and bipartisan partner on this legislative effort, Congressman John Larson. Congressman Larson represents Connecticut's 1st District. He also sits on the House Ways and Means Committee, including the Subcommittee on Tax Policy and Social Security, where he serves as the ranking member. He's a longtime advocate for enhancing research and development incentives, having led the effort to permanently extend the R&D tax credit back in 2015. Congressman Larson, thanks to you for joining us today for this conversation as well.
Happy to join my colleague and all of you. It's a great concept and look forward to working with you.
Well, we appreciate the effort. We appreciate the conversation today and to learn from the two of you how we can help move this important effort forward. So I want to, first of all, again, thank you both for leading the effort to restore the ability to deduct research and development costs in the year they occur, rather than having them spread out over 5 or even 15 years. And I want to ask each of you, Congressman Estes, I'll start with you. Can you help us understand how research and development really has spurred innovation and U.S. global competitiveness?
Yeah, well, throughout our 247-year history, America has always been viewed as a global leader and innovator. And we've utilized that to make great advances in aviation and photography and space exploration and telecommunications and agriculture production. And one of the things that we've done is we've invented everything from the air conditioner to the zipper. And so it shows that these innovations kind of show the advancement of our way of life around the world. As Thomas Edison actually said, is that he didn't fail multiple times doing his innovations, but he actually went through the process and found multiple ways not to do things so that we can actually do them better going forward.
That's a great quote, and so true about the iterative process and the importance of that research and development. Congressman Larson, let me ask you the same question. From your perspective, how does research and development spur innovation and make the U.S. competitive on a global scale?
Well, I think research and development is critical and crucial for the continued growth and dominance of the United States in the global economy. Richard Duncan has just written a book, many of you are probably aware of it, called The Money Revolution, et cetera, that's been out there, and where he talks about the competition that looms with China. And I think this provides an opportunity to unite and work across the aisle with a common goal that is only going to help further incentivize the economy and further help job creation, and especially in areas, well, like my colleague who is a former engineer as well, but engineers and scientists and individuals who are going to be contributing to the industries of the future. Without research and development tax credits, and especially being able to make them available now in the current year that they're being experienced, we won't be able to move as aggressively forward. China doesn't have a Congress. China doesn't have a democracy. They are very authoritarian, and they are setting a path and a tone to surpass the United States. So therefore, I think, and I know Ron knows this as well, that we've got to work together to make sure that we maintain our competitive edge. And this is one of the primary tools that we have to use to get that done.
Well, and I appreciate, Congressman Larson, the mention of China and the global competitive issue. And that brings me to my next question, which is to ask both of you to talk about your bill. We know, and you've both alluded to this, that the loss of the ability to deduct research and development expenses in the year they occur really weakens U.S. global competitiveness vis-a-vis China and other international competitors that the U.S. faces. And in fact, since this change that your legislation is endeavoring to reverse, since this change went into effect, the change to the way companies can deduct their expenses went into effect, the U.S. became one of only 2 countries in the OECD that doesn't allow R&D expenses to be deducted in the year they occur. So as a result of that, the U.S. has dropped to 30th out of 38 countries in the OECD with respect to R&D incentives, creating a very real risk that incentives are moving to other countries, and research and development will as well. Congressman Estes, let me start with you on this question. Can you tell us how your bill will help U.S. competitiveness globally as a result of how the U.S. compares to other countries on R&D incentives?
Yeah, we know how important it is to make the R&D investments in the United States, because that leads to more manufacturing and production and more jobs and a growing economy in the United States. And the American Innovation and R&D Competitiveness Act will help make sure that more R&D is done in the United States. As mentioned earlier, it'll take it from having a 5-year time frame to depreciate that expense to the immediate year, which will help so much in cash flow. And you know, this was the policy that was in place up until 2022. So we need to get back to that so that we can continue to help growth within the United States and help make sure that not only do we do well now, but we also do well for the future, because that research and development leads to so many more jobs in manufacturing and production for American workers.
And Congressman Larson, let me ask you the same question about your bill with Mr. Estes. You mentioned China as a global competitor. What's your perspective on how this legislation that you've been advancing on a bipartisan basis will help U.S. competitiveness globally and address that concern that you raised about how we compare to other countries as far as R&D incentives?
You detailed that pretty well by demonstrating where we currently rank. And if you go back historically and before the 2017 tax provision, Uh, I don't think anyone thought that that would expire, and yet it did. So what we're trying to do is put back into the law what the ability to make same year deductions. So that will provide the opportunity for us to compete. Without it, we're only going to continue to decline. And in the face of this very authoritarian and direct move on the Chinese to be globally dominant by 2040 is a real challenge. The good news is, and thanks to enlightened guys like Ron, who come from a background where he understands the importance and significance of this, especially in terms of making sure that we're investing in the industries of the future. And what does that require? That we're getting the best engineers, the best scientists, the best chemists, the best people who understand what it's going to take. And that all evolves around wages at the end of the day. And if you look at the R&D tax credit, et cetera, and then how it's been utilized in the past, et cetera, is to help create that incentive and promote the very best in our country, and also attract from outside of our borders the very best and brightest here because of what we can provide. And in order for us to maintain that cutting edge and for us to be on top of the world, this has got to pass. And that's why Ron and I are working so hard on it.
Well, and it's great that you mentioned that job aspect, because we've been talking about this as a tax bill, but really we should be talking about this as a jobs bill as well. And Mr. Estes, I wanted to come back to you on this question of the wages and salaries component that Congressman Larson mentioned. We know that the R&D spending that we're talking about is really spending on people. 75% of R&D spending is first and foremost used for wages and salaries. So this really is a jobs bill that we're talking about. And we know that the private sector in the US accounts for more than 75% of all R&D spending. That's $612 billion in 2021 in the US. And by the way, it's not just big technology companies are doing this investment in the wages and salaries for R&D investment. 15% of that spending comes from small businesses. So Mr. Estes, you're an engineer by training, civil engineering, if I recall. You know that R&D jobs are good paying jobs with an average wage in this country of more than $155,000. Talk to us about how this tax bill is really a jobs bill and what it means for the job market in the US.
Yeah, it really is important from the jobs front. You know, the trend that we've seen over the last 20 years, where the actual share of R&D within the United States has gone down from 40% to 30%, whereas China has grown from 5% to 24%, right at the point. So, and we've seen that jobs flowing out of the United States to China as part of that. You know, when you actually are spending money on research and development, you're hiring the engineers, you're hiring the scientists, you're hiring the best and the brightest, as John mentioned, to actually focus on coming up with these great ideas that take us into the future. And one of the statistics that's out there from a couple of studies is that for every $1 billion in R&D investment, it leads to and supports 17,000 jobs earning $1.4 billion in salary. And so obviously that's a big impact. And that not only is from a short-term standpoint of actually doing the research and development effort, but ultimately plays out into the manufacturing production jobs and into the future that continues to maintain our competitiveness as well as our leadership throughout the world.
Congressman Larson, you started us off on this idea of talking about this as a jobs bill and the impact on jobs, and would love to hear your additional thoughts on how the R&D jobs that this bill will promote will impact the overall job market in Connecticut and across the country.
Well, I visit a lot of our companies in Connecticut and understand how important it is to them individually for their growth. But as Ron points out as well, also the growth of the communities and the states and the nation that they're a part of. because the wages and salaries associated with these jobs are upscale. And where do they invest that money? Right back into the community, the state, and the nation. And so we need to have these kinds of high-paying jobs that are focused on next generation industry, next generation development. That can only happen through research and development. And that's enhanced when you're hiring the brightest and the best, and further enhances not only the businesses, but the entire economy for the region. So it's a win-win situation all across the board. And that's why Ron and I are working so hard to get this done.
We've talked about the job aspect of this. We've talked about the investment incentive aspect. And I wanted to ask the both of you a question about the national security implications of this important measure that we're all talking about today. We know that research and development is an innovation issue, important for U.S. economic growth, important for jobs growth, but it's also incredibly important to America's national security. In fact, the National Science and Technology Council just issued a report on R&D investments and the importance to American national security. And the report concluded very clearly that sustained R&D investments are essential to ensure that the U.S. remains able to secure and protect the American people in the era of increased competition. Congressman Estes, let me come back to you on the question of the national security implications of research and development spending. I know this is something you've been focusing a lot on, particularly in aerospace and defense, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to hear your thoughts on how this is a national security imperative as well.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, when we think about what's happened over the last few years, and we've seen China, who is I mean, there's no doubt about it that they're viewing their role in the world as an adversary for the United States. And as they've increased their research and development share over 400% over the last 20 plus years, it certainly has an impact there. I mean, we know as we look to the future and we look at all of the technology changes that are going to happen. You look at artificial intelligence, we look at cybersecurity and the implications and our use of technology in our daily life, not just from a business standpoint, but for our personal activities. We look at things like hypersonics and some of the new technologies that are on the defense side that are even beyond what we do on a business or a consumer individual side. We obviously need to make sure that we're in the leading position, because we know that not only do we come up with good ideas, and it's American innovation that have led to so many positive things across the world. We're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to share those good ideas around the open societies and the free trade that we've continued to promote. And so it's going to better not just the United States and our competitiveness with adversaries like China, but also help others around the world as well.
Congressman Larson, what are your thoughts on the national security implications of this bill, and more generally the national security implications of ensuring that R&D investments take place in the U.S.?
Paramount. And let's go back in history, and in a similar situation in the United States, dealing with a very autocratic government and being in a race for them. In this case, it was a race for space. And we had a young president at the time who said that we put a man on the moon in 10 years and everybody rolled their eyes. But in the United States of America, we did it in 9 years, not 10. And in challenging the American people and industry and knowing the importance of R&D, we were unified. We were unified in that race because at the time it was the Russians who had launched Sputnik, who was ahead of us, and were bound and determined that they were going to dominate, just as the Chinese are today. And so this presents us again with that opportunity to bring the country together in good old-fashioned competition, and especially as it relates to national security and the innovation and the technology and the American ingenuity that is going to be so critical to us remaining dominant not only here at home, but abroad, and also attracting people from around the globe to come here where our lifestyle is different and it is not an autocratic society, and where people do have enormous rights and privileges and freedoms, etc., all of which bode well for investment in research and development to make sure that we stay on that high level plane and step up to this global competition that we're involved with, and this enemy that is bound in term. An enemy may be too harsh a term, sounds like it, but in terms of a competitor that's out to beat us. And that's why I think it's so important that we, and both of us care deeply about aviation. In my hometown of East Hartford, the home of Pratt Whitney aircraft, and when we look at the F-35 and the Joint Strike Fighter Caucus, et cetera, we understand, and especially given today and everything that's going on, even in the Ukraine, and what's needed out there in terms of security in maintaining not only national security, but global security as well.
It's such an important point. And Congressman Larson, you mentioned earlier the goal of bringing the best and the brightest from around the world to the U.S. to learn, to study, to become engineers, to start the next great technology company here in the U.S. And nowhere is that more important than in aerospace and defense. And I wanted to ask Congressman Estes about this. You've talked about the importance of aerospace in your district. You represent the air capital of the world there in Kansas. And you've talked about the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, the legislation we're talking about today, in terms of the R&D that it will inspire to bring new breakthroughs to technology and new jobs to our country. And a report just issued by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, found that R&D funded $3.7 billion in investment activity in Kansas in 2022. And the average wage for those R&D jobs in Kansas is more than $85,000 per year. So let's talk about the air capital of the world that your district is home to, a big part of the aerospace industry. What are your thoughts on how this bill impacts your constituents and aerospace? And what are you hearing from them about the importance of R&D investment when you're back home in the district?
Yeah, it really is important. And, as we talk about Wichita as their capital of the world, just because, for over a century now, we've had great innovators that have been in Kansas and looking at how do they develop and grow their industry. And roughly 2/3 of all the world's embedded general aviation came out of Wichita, and we've made over 250,000 airplanes over the last 100 years that are actually out and are being used by consumers around the world. Obviously, to do that, you have to have great innovation. You have to have a lot of research and development. In the early days of the aviation, pioneers like Lloyd Stearman and Clyde Cessna and Ollie Van Beach, they came to Wichita because we had great open skies and a lot of flat planes to in case the first design didn't work as well as they had intended it to. But they stayed because of having a good opportunity to translate that research and development and those ideas into a great workable product. And as you mentioned, Jason, the research and development leads to good, high-paying jobs. Both on the research end for the scientists and engineers that are actually doing the development, but so much on the manufacturing and the support end on an ongoing basis. And that's why it's so important to Kansas engineers and developers and manufacturers and all of the support staff and entities around there to make sure that they can have the cash flow, make sure the business operates, and make sure that we'll have a long-term source of good paying jobs to help maintain the American workers.
Congressman Larson, when this bill was introduced, you similarly talked about what you were hearing about from the folks at home. You said that research and development are a driver of jobs and innovation in Connecticut and across our nation. This issue is hardly new to you. You have been a leader on this. As I mentioned earlier, since way back in 2015, when you led the effort to enact a permanent extension of the R&D tax credit. We know the R&D tax credit has been crucial for American businesses, giving them the certainty they need to invest here at home and support the good paying jobs we're talking about. That ITIF Foundation report that I mentioned earlier as to Kansas also studied business activity in Connecticut and found that last year, R&D funded about $8.2 billion in business activity in Connecticut. Average wage for that supported activity in Connecticut, about $104,000 per year. So good paying jobs and a lot of economic activity. Congressman Larson, let me ask you about what you're hearing back home about the importance of research and development, the impact on the Connecticut economy, what you're hearing from your constituents back in the district, and also what led you to become a leader on this important issue, as I mentioned, way back in 2015, when you were talking loudly about the importance of certainty for research and development tax credits.
Well, Connecticut's not quite the size of Kansas in terms of being a state, but in terms of both the military-industrial complex and in terms of having, incredible corporations like Pratt Whitney and Raytheon and Sikorsky and Electric Boat, et cetera, which are major contributors to our national security and major recruiters of talent and focus on science and engineering and making sure that we're staying abreast of what technological developments are going to be needed to make us not only competitive, but dominant globally. And the key issue, and Ron talked about this a little also, is the supply chain that's associated with that. So, Joe Courtney and I, Joe's on the Armed Services Committee, always talk about whose district has more or does more for the specific, whether it's Electric Boat or Pratt Whitney aircraft. And it's really about not only the people that they employ directly, but that whole supply chain that provides the various parts and the technology, and again, the science and engineering. So you see that this is a growth multiplier in terms of what it means to make sure that we have R&D tax credits that are available now in the present, and people are able to take advantage of them in the same year. And by doing that, it just increases competition, attracts more interested and well-educated and technologically trained individuals that are able to advance the cause that we all favor, which is for the United States to remain dominant economically and dominant technologically, and making sure that we're staying ahead of our competitors who have us in their sights.
All those great innovations that we've been talking about, from aerospace to technology and everything in between, that originated in the U.S., we are in a competitive race, and the competition right now is the U.S. and China. And Congressman Estes, you mentioned that China competition issue as a primary driver for a lot of the important research and development activities that are taking place here in the U.S. I wanted to ask you first, and then Congressman Larson, to talk about the China competition issue. China's a huge market, a huge economy. And they are, not surprisingly, expanding their own deductions for research and development expenses for manufacturing companies, including for tech manufacturing. Believe it or not, in China, they're expanding those incentives to an extra 100% of eligible expenses. So in China, if you're a manufacturer doing research and development, you get a 200% deduction for 1 year of research and development that's completed in China. And China's not alone. Other nations around the world are doing these kind of incentives as well. Germany, France, the UK all have new increased R&D incentives in place. But of course, as the law currently stands, even though, as Mr. Larson mentioned, we had all hoped this would never go into effect, it's in effect now, and U.S. companies have to spread their expenses not over 1 year, like they do in China, but over 5 years for U.S. Research and development, and 15 years if that research and development is done in U.S. companies' overseas facilities. So, Mr. Estes, I want to start with you on this question. Given this China competition angle that we've been talking about, and the U.S. global competitiveness generally, how important is your legislative measure to encouraging R&D in the U.S., and how would this bill, the American Innovation and Jobs Act, promote R&D here in the U.S.?
Yeah, it really is critically important. As you said earlier, I mean, we're already, the United States is already ranked 30th out of 38 of the OECD countries. And when you look at under current law, a business can only deduct 20%, or they have to spread it out over 5 years, and equivalently getting a 20% deduction out of that, versus China doing a 200% credit on the deduction. And so basically there's a 10 times difference there. And when we look at businesses that are making long-term decisions, because this isn't a short-term decision to stand up a new research and development facility, or to hire additional staff to do a particular work. And we need to get our law right now, so that people have the opportunity to make those decisions and be prepared, not just in the short term, but over the long term. And this affects so many people in terms of, we've talked a lot about large businesses, we talked a lot about aerospace and others, but it runs the gauntlet of large and small companies in terms of the impact.
Congressman Larson, what's your perspective on the importance of this for global competitiveness, given what China's doing?
Makes a good point too, about not only is this important for the major corporations, but the small businesses and those supply chains that we were talking about as well. And the competition with China is real, and they are focused, razor sharp focus, in terms of being bold enough to say that they will be globally dominant by 2040. Congress in America needs to wake up. They're not, take them at their word here. They are not fooling around. And as you indicated, you know, to have a 200% incentive certainly is their way of saying to the rest of the world, come to China and see how you'll be advantaged in this nature. So the threat is real, it's viable, and that's why I think practical, common sense legislation that was in effect before needs to be reinstituted and needs to pass this Congress so that people can begin taking advantage of it ASAP.
We have time for just one last topic related to this legislation, and it's something you both just alluded to. Congressman Estes, I'll start with you, and it's the issue of small businesses. We've been talking about large industries, aerospace, technology, and other related industries that are impacted by this, but we know that a significant percentage of R&D spending in the U.S. it takes place from small businesses. It's more than 15% of the $600 billion figure that I mentioned earlier. And some of the hardest hit companies, therefore, by this change in R&D tax amortization will be small businesses. And they're businesses that don't have large accounting departments. They may not even have heard about these new R&D amortization requirements until they hear it from their accountants when it's time to file their taxes. So, Congressman Estes, I wanted to conclude on this note about whether this is a small business issue as much as a big business issue, and whether your legislation helps address the complexity and the uncertainty of these changes to tax law that are likely impacting small businesses in your district.
Yeah, it really is an impact on the small businesses. You can naturally think about the impact on large businesses, whether you think about an aerospace company, a defense company, a pharmaceutical company, or new technology development. But for our smaller businesses, as you mentioned, roughly 15% of the research and development expenditure and investments being made in small businesses smaller than 500 employees. That has an outsized impact on them, because if you have a 3-4 million a year income, and you're making a $500,000 investment in new research or new development or new equipment, it has an impact on whether you can write that off the first year and be able to cash flow your expense, or whether you have to spend that out over 5 years. So it's critically an impact on smaller businesses, in some ways much more than a larger companies and corporations that are out there. So it's important that we get this right, and we fix the current law to get back to where it helps make America competitive again.
Congressman Larson, I assume you're hearing about this from small businesses in your district as well, not only about the complexity and the uncertainty of the change, but really what it means for their ability to invest, make the R&D investments they need to grow their businesses.
In all the businesses that I visit, it's paramount. Ron is exactly right. And let me associate myself with his comments, but also, this is why, the ITI is so important as well. Because of what Ron mentioned, and you mentioned it in your comments now a couple of times. We're also looking at businesses that don't have, a team of lawyers, a team of accountants, and people that are there to assist them in the complexity of the law. The more that the law is straightforward and plain and clear, and that you can make this deduction, the more helpful it is. And the more that ITI gets this information out there as to why this is so critical, the more successful our legislation is going to become, and the more aggressively we have to continue to push this to make sure it gets across the goal line.
Well, I appreciate that. And you have the commitment of ITI as the Global Trade Association of the tech industry and all of our member companies, that we are going to continue to work hard to spread the word about the importance of the American Innovation and Jobs Act. Congressman Estes, Congressman Larson, thank you so much for walking us through this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And although we've reached the end of our event today, it's certainly not the end of this important conversation. As I thank Congressman Estes and Congressman Larson for joining us today, I also want to thank all of you, our audience, for sharing your time and your knowledge and your efforts with us as well. As we continue the conversation about the American Innovation and Jobs Act, ITI continues its work to move forward on this important legislation. And we look forward to partnering with all of you to continue this effort into the future. Be sure to follow ITI on Twitter at ITI_tech-tweets, and find us on LinkedIn to stay connected. I also encourage you to take the time to visit us at bridgeforinnovation.org to learn more. I'm Jason Oxman on behalf